A September Saturday, bright sunshine, the perfect kind of day to be outside, breathing fresh air, walking through the woods. Victoria Schafer was doing exactly that. She had her camera in her hands, was standing at the foot of some stone stairs in one of Ohio's most beautiful parks, and was about to capture the perfect photo. But what Victoria didn't know, what no one in that park knew, is that above the cliff, more than 20 meters high, two teenagers were looking down, and in their hands they had a wooden log, a log that weighed more than 30 kilos. What happened next would change the lives of 4 children forever. It would destroy a family, and it would reveal something disturbing about what can happen when a moment of stupidity mixes with gravity and indifference. But here's the strangest thing of all. After that log fell and hit Victoria, after she lay on the ground bleeding, those 2 teenagers didn't run down to help her. They didn't call 911. They didn't tell anyone what they had done. They walked out of the park as if nothing had happened. And for weeks, the police had no idea who had killed Victoria Schafer. They thought it had been an accident, a log that fell on its own from the cliff. Bad luck, natural tragedy. Victoria was 44 years old when she died. She lived in Chillicothe, Ohio, a small town of about 20,000 inhabitants located in the southern part of the state. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, where neighbors greet each other in the morning, where news travels fast. The kind of place where someone's death shakes the entire community. Victoria was a professional photographer, and she wasn't an amateur who took photos occasionally as a hobby. She was an artist who had built a successful business from her passion. She specialized in high school senior portraits, those photos that kids take before graduating, the ones they put in the yearbook, the ones they frame and hang on the living room wall, the ones they keep for decades as memories of their youth. And Victoria was extraordinarily good at what she did. Her clients adored her because she didn't just take pretty pictures. She had a special gift for making teenagers feel comfortable in front of the camera. She knew how to get genuine smiles from them instead of those forced grimaces that appear in so many studio photos. She captured moments that families treasured for years. Her style was unique. She liked working outdoors, taking advantage of natural light and Ohio's landscapes. She preferred forests, fields, places with personality. That's why Hocking Hills State Park was one of her favorite places for photo sessions. The cliffs, waterfalls, and rock formations provided spectacular backgrounds that made her photos stand out. But more than a photographer, Victoria was a mother. She had 4 children. 4. Think about that for a moment. 4 people who depended on her, who loved her, who expected her home every night. 4 children who needed their mom for the big things and the small things, to help them with homework, to make them breakfast, to hug them when they were sad, to celebrate their achievements, to be there. Her husband, Fritz Schafer, was her life partner. They had spent years together building a family, a home, a future. Fritz worked as a firefighter in the community. He was the kind of person who regularly risked his life to save others. He had seen tragedies. He had responded to accidents. He had consoled families who had lost loved ones, but he never imagined that he would be the one receiving that call, that his own wife would be the victim of an absurd tragedy. People who knew Victoria described her as someone full of energy and positivity, always smiling, always looking for beauty in small things. She had that ability that some photographers have of seeing the world in a different way, of finding light where others only see shadows, of capturing emotions that others don't even notice. She was active in her community. She knew many people. She had photographed hundreds of families over the years. In a small town like Chillicothe, that meant that practically everyone had some connection with her. A photo she had taken of them, an interaction at some event, a smile she had given them. And that September Saturday, Victoria had gone to Hocking Hills State Park because she had work to do. She had scheduled a photo session with a young student who wanted graduation portraits. It was a normal work day, another day doing what she loved in one of her favorite places. There was no reason to think that something bad could happen. Hocking Hills is one of Ohio's most visited state parks. Every year, more than 3 million people go there to walk the trails, see the waterfalls, explore the caves and rock formations. It's a place of stunning natural beauty that attracts tourists from all over the American Midwest. The park covers thousands of acres of wooded and rugged terrain. There are deep canyons carved by thousands of years of erosion. There are waterfalls that fall from impressive heights. There are caves and sandstone formations that look like they're from another planet. And there are cliffs, many cliffs. The most famous area of the park is called Old Man's Cave. It's a spectacular rock formation that includes a canyon with vertical walls that rise dozens of meters above the valley floor. The name comes from a hermit who supposedly lived in one of the caves in the 19th century. To access the different areas of Old Man's Cave, there are stairs carved into the stone that descend from the top down to the bottom of the canyon. There are wooden bridges that cross streams. There are observation platforms from where you can see the entire valley. And there are trails that wind between the rocks and trees. It's exactly the kind of place where a photographer would want to work. The natural light is perfect, especially during the golden hours of sunrise and sunset. The backgrounds are spectacular and varied. You can find dozens of different photo locations without having to walk very far. Victoria knew this park well. She had worked there many times before. She knew where to find the best views. She knew how to take advantage of the light at different times of day. She knew which trails to take to get to the perfect locations for her photo sessions. But the park also has inherent dangers. The cliffs are real. Falls are possible. Every year there are accidents at Hocking Hills. People who slip on wet rocks. People who stray from marked trails. People who underestimate the dangers of the terrain. There are signs throughout the park warning visitors about the dangers. Signs that say not to stray from the trails. Signs that warn about loose rocks and landslides. Signs that remind people that nature can be dangerous if you're not careful. But what the signs don't warn about, because it would be impossible to warn about everything, is about the danger that other people represent. About the possibility that someone above a cliff might decide to throw something down without thinking about who might be in the impact zone. That Saturday, the park was relatively crowded. It was a beautiful September day, the kind of day that attracts families, couples, and groups of friends to enjoy nature before the cold of autumn arrives. Victoria was in one of the most popular areas of the park, near the stairs that descend toward Old Man's Cave. She was working with her client, looking for the best angles, adjusting her equipment, doing what she had done hundreds of times before. And above, at the top of the cliff, two teenagers were about to make a decision that would change many lives forever. Before continuing with what happened that day, you need to know who the two teenagers involved were, because understanding who they were helps to understand how something like this could happen. Jaden Churchius and Jordan Buckley were 16 years old in September 2019. They were high school students in the Logan, Ohio area, a small town not far from Hocking Hills State Park. They were friends who had grown up in the area and knew the park well. From what is known from investigations and subsequent reports, neither of them had serious criminal records before this incident. They weren't known delinquents. They had no history of violence. They were, by all external appearances, normal teenagers from a rural Ohio community. But that's part of what makes this story so disturbing. It wasn't hardened criminals who killed Victoria Schafer. It was two 16-year-old boys who probably looked like any other teenager you know, who went to school, who had families, who probably played video games and spent time on social media like any other young person their age. The day of the incident, Jaden and Jordan had gone to the park like many other young people from the area. Hocking Hills was a popular place to hang out, especially on nice days. You could walk the trails, explore the caves, spend time with friends away from adult supervision. It's not completely clear what they had been doing during the hours before the incident. Probably walking through the park. Probably doing the things that teenagers do when they have free time and access to an interesting place. At some point, they arrived at the top of the cliff near Old Man's Cave. From that elevated position, they could see the valley below. They could see the stone stairs. They could see the people walking along the trails and stopping at the observation platforms. And they could see Victoria Schafer, standing with her camera, working on her photo session. What happened in the following minutes would define the rest of their lives. It was approximately 5:30 in the afternoon on September 2nd, 2019. The sunlight was beginning to soften as sunset approached. Photographers call this moment the golden hour. because the light has a special quality that makes everything look more beautiful. Victoria was taking advantage of every second of that light. She was standing on a platform near the foot of the stairs that descend toward Old Man's Cave. Her client, a young high school student, was nearby, following Victoria's instructions for the photo session. According to witnesses who were in the area, Victoria was focused on her work. She was adjusting her camera, looking up to evaluate the light, looking for the best angles, doing what she had done thousands of times before in her career as a photographer. There was no reason for her to look up with concern. There was no warning of what was about to happen. And then, without any warning, something fell from the sky. Witnesses who were nearby described different things. Some said they heard a loud noise first, like something cutting through the air at high speed. Others said the first sound they heard was the impact, a dry and horrible thud that echoed through the canyon. Some initially thought it was a rock that had broken loose from the cliff. That happens sometimes at Hocking Hills. Erosion loosens stones that eventually fall. Others thought maybe a tree or large branch had fallen, but when they looked toward where Victoria was, they saw she was on the ground, not moving. There was blood, a lot of blood. What had fallen wasn't a rock or just any branch. It was a wooden log approximately 1.8 meters long that weighed more than 33 kilos. It had fallen from a height of more than 20 meters. The physics of that impact are brutal. An object of that weight falling from that height acquires devastating speed and force. Victoria didn't have any chance. People started screaming. Someone called 911. Others ran toward Victoria to try to help her. But the injuries were catastrophic. The impact had been directly to the head. Paramedics arrived as quickly as they could given the remote location within the park. But when they arrived, there was nothing to be done. Victoria Schafer was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 44 years old. She left behind her husband Fritz and their 4 children. And while emergency services processed the scene, while witnesses gave their statements, while the news began to spread through the community, 2 teenagers were walking out of the park without saying a word about what they had done. When authorities arrived at the scene and began their initial investigation, the conclusion seemed obvious. This had all the characteristics of a tragic natural accident. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources and the Hocking County Sheriff's Office were the first to respond. They examined the scene, they photographed the log that had killed Victoria, they interviewed witnesses who were in the area. The log was a piece of partially rotted wood, the kind you find lying around in the forest anywhere in Ohio. It was exactly the type of natural debris that sometimes accumulates at the edges of cliffs and occasionally falls due to erosion, wind, rain, or simply the passage of time. Hocking Hills has a history of incidents related to falling rocks and debris. It's not something frequent, but it's not unknown either. The sandstone formations that make the park so beautiful are also inherently unstable. Erosion is a continuous process. The initial investigators found no obvious evidence that someone had deliberately pushed the log. There were no witnesses who had seen anyone at the top of the cliff at the moment of impact. There were no clear footprints or physical evidence suggesting human intervention. Furthermore, the idea that someone could have done this on purpose seemed absurd. Why would anyone do something like that? Who would throw a log from a cliff toward where there are innocent people? It didn't make sense. The simplest explanation, and in a certain sense the most comforting one, was that it had been an accident. A terrible tragedy, yes. A devastating event for Victoria's family, but an accident nonetheless. Nature doing its thing. Bad luck at the worst possible moment. One of those horrible things that sometimes happen that no one can prevent. The initial investigation concluded exactly that. Accidental death. The case was effectively closed. Victoria Schafer was buried. Her family began the painful process of grief. The Chillicothe community mourned the loss of one of their own, and everyone tried to move forward with their lives, although the pain of loss remained present. But there was something that didn't add up, something that no one had noticed yet, something that was about to change everything they thought they knew about Victoria Schafer's death. After Victoria died, weeks passed. The official investigation was closed. The conclusion of accidental death was recorded. The family was trying to rebuild their lives without her. Fritz Schafer, Victoria's husband, was going through personal hell. He had to keep working as a firefighter because bills don't wait. He had to care for 4 children who were devastated by the loss of their mother. He had to organize Victoria's affairs, including her photography business. And all the time, he had to live with the idea that his wife had died in the most absurd way possible. A log falling on her while she was doing her job. 1 in a million. Cosmic bad luck. Victoria's children were also suffering. How do you process your mother's death when you're 10, 12, 14 years old? How do you understand that the person who was always there for you suddenly won't be there ever again? The Chillicothe community organized events to honor Victoria's memory. There were vigils. There were messages of condolence on social media. There were donations to help the family. People came together in the way that small communities come together when a tragedy occurs. But while all this was happening, while the family mourned and the community offered its support, something else was happening in another part of the county. Jaden Churchius and Jordan Buckley were keeping a secret. They had been in the park that day. They had been at the top of the cliff when Victoria died. And they knew exactly what had happened. Because they had pushed that log. But they didn't tell anyone. They didn't call the police. They didn't confess what they had done. They showed no external signs of remorse or guilt. Instead, they went on with their lives as if nothing had happened. They went to school. They did their homework. They hung out with their friends. They probably saw the news about Victoria's death. They probably heard people talk about the tragedy. And they didn't say a word. It's hard to imagine what was going through their minds during those weeks. Did they know they had killed someone? Did they understand the gravity of what they had done? Did they feel guilty? Were they afraid of being discovered? What we do know is that they kept silent. For weeks, they let Victoria's family believe that her death had been an accident. They let the case close. They let the truth remain buried. But here's the thing about secrets, especially big secrets. It's very hard to keep them, especially when you're 16 years old and you've just killed someone. It's not completely clear exactly how the truth started to leak out. Subsequent investigations suggest that the teenagers couldn't keep the secret completely contained. Maybe one of them told a close friend what they had done. You know, those conversations you have when you need to tell someone something that's eating you up inside. Hey, you have to promise me you won't tell anyone. But that kind of conversation. Maybe they told a girlfriend or someone they thought they could trust. Teenagers often feel the need to impress people they like, even with information that should remain secret. Maybe they simply couldn't bear the weight of what had happened anymore. Killing someone, even if accidentally, even if it wasn't your intention, is a huge weight to carry. Especially when you're 16 years old and your brain is still developing. What we do know is that the rumor started to circulate, first in whispers, among small groups of teenagers who knew Jaden and Jordan. Then louder, spreading to more people. People started saying that Victoria Schafer's death hadn't been an accident, that someone had thrown that log on purpose. In a small community like those surrounding Hocking Hills State Park, rumors travel fast. And eventually, those rumors reached the ears of people who had an obligation to report them to authorities. According to reports, it was other high school students who finally alerted authorities about what they had heard. Teenagers who knew Jaden and Jordan, who had heard the stories about what supposedly happened in the park, and who decided that information was too important to keep. It's hard to know exactly what motivated these students to speak up. Maybe they felt it was the right thing to do. Maybe they were disturbed by what they had heard. Maybe they simply didn't want to carry the weight of knowing something like that without doing anything about it. What we do know is that approximately 1 month after Victoria's death, authorities received information that would completely change the nature of the case. Victoria Schafer's death had not been an accident. It had been caused by 2 teenagers who had pushed a log from a cliff, and suddenly, everything changed. When the new information reached authorities, the reaction was immediate. A case that had been closed as accidental death now had to be reopened and reinvestigated from scratch. Detective Jeff Mullen of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources was assigned to lead the new investigation. Mullen was an experienced investigator who had worked on difficult cases before, but this one presented unique challenges. First, time had passed since the incident, almost a month. That meant that any physical evidence at the scene had probably been altered or destroyed by weather, other park visitors, and the simple passage of time. Second, the main witnesses to the crime were also the suspects. There was no one else who had directly seen what happened at the top of the cliff. The witnesses who were below had only seen the aftermath, not the act itself. Third, the initial information came from rumors and second or third-hand conversations. Investigators needed to find the people who had directly heard Jaden and Jordan talk about what they had done and convince them to cooperate with the investigation. Mullen and his team began by interviewing the people who had initially reported the rumors. They wanted to know exactly what they had heard, who they had heard it from, and when they had heard it. The interviews revealed a disturbing pattern. Multiple people had heard Jaden and Jordan, or people close to them, talk about having thrown something from the cliff on the day Victoria died. The details varied slightly from one version to another, as usually happens when stories are passed from person to person, but the core was consistent. 2 boys had pushed a log from the cliff. They had done it on purpose, and a woman had died as a result. Investigators also discovered that the teenagers had apparently described what they did as a prank, something they thought would be funny, to see how the log fell, maybe scare someone. They hadn't anticipated that it would actually hit someone, much less kill them, but that didn't change the fact that a woman was dead because of their actions. With the new information, investigators began to reconstruct what had really happened the day Victoria died. They returned to the crime scene. They examined the top of the cliff from where it was believed the log had been pushed. They looked for any physical evidence that might have survived the passage of time. They also reanalyzed the log that had killed Victoria. Now that they knew it had probably been deliberately pushed, they examined it with new eyes. They looked for marks that might indicate it had been manipulated. They evaluated its size and weight to determine if it was plausible that 2 teenagers could have moved it. The log measured approximately 1.8 meters long and weighed more than 33 kilos. It was large and heavy, but definitely movable by 2 young people working together. And the wood was partially rotted, which made it lighter than a fresh log of the same size would have been. Investigators also interviewed more witnesses who had been in the park that day. They specifically asked if anyone had seen 2 teenagers at the top of the cliff before or after the incident. They asked if anyone had noticed suspicious behavior. Some people remembered seeing young people in the area, but memories were vague and contradictory after so much time. No one could positively identify Jaden and Jordan or confirm having seen them push the log. But investigators had something more valuable than eyewitnesses. They had the suspects' own words. The things Jaden and Jordan had supposedly said to their friends and acquaintances about what they had done. Detective Mullen and his team began building a case based on those statements. They systematically interviewed each person who had supposedly heard the teenagers talk about the incident. They documented each conversation. They looked for consistencies and contradictions. The picture that emerged was clear. Jaden Churchius and Jordan Buckley had deliberately pushed a log from the cliff. They knew there were people below. And after the log fell and killed Victoria, they had fled without doing anything to help her. With enough testimonial evidence collected, the time came to confront Jaden and Jordan directly. Investigators located the 2 teenagers and brought them in for separate interrogations. The strategy was to interview them separately to see if their stories matched or contradicted each other. Initially, according to reports, both teenagers denied any involvement in Victoria's death. That wasn't unexpected. Most suspects initially deny when confronted with serious accusations. But investigators had an advantage. They had the statements the teenagers themselves had supposedly made to their friends. They could confront them with their own words. As the interrogations progressed, the teenagers' story began to change. First, they admitted having been in the park that day. Then, they admitted having been near the cliff. And finally, according to reports, both admitted having pushed the log. The confessions were devastating in their simplicity. According to what was made public later, the teenagers said they had pushed the log to play a prank, that they thought it would be funny to see it fall, that they didn't think it would actually hit anyone. But they also admitted that they knew there were people below when they pushed the log. They could see them from their position on the cliff. They knew they were throwing a heavy object toward an area where there were human beings. And after the log fell and they heard the screams, they simply left. They didn't go down to see what had happened. They didn't call for help. They didn't tell anyone what they had done. They walked away as if nothing had happened. On October 7, 2019, approximately 1 month after Victoria Schafer's death, Jaden Churchius and Jordan Buckley were formally arrested. The initial charges were involuntary manslaughter, but that would change quickly. The county prosecutor, Annette Farley, reviewed the evidence and the teenagers' confessions, and she reached a conclusion that many in the community shared. The involuntary manslaughter charges were not sufficient to reflect the gravity of what they had done. Involuntary manslaughter implies killing someone without intent, generally through negligence or recklessness. But in this case, the teenagers had acted deliberately. They had chosen to push that log. They knew there were people below. That went beyond simple negligence. After a deeper evaluation of the case, the charges were elevated to murder. Specifically, the teenagers were charged with murder under a legal theory that doesn't require proving intent to kill. In Ohio, you can be charged with murder if you kill someone while committing another felony, or if you act with extreme disregard for human life. Throwing a 33-kilo log from a cliff toward an area where you know there are people meets that definition. The decision to charge the teenagers as adults was also significant. Although they were only 16 years old, the gravity of the crime and the circumstances surrounding it justified, according to the prosecution, treating them as adults under the law. This meant that if they were convicted, they would face adult sentences instead of the generally milder consequences of the juvenile justice system. The case of Jaden and Jordan provoked intense debate about how the legal system should treat minors who commit serious crimes. On one hand, there were those who argued that the teenagers deserved the harshest possible punishment. An innocent woman was dead. 4 children had lost their mother. A husband had lost his life partner. The consequences of the crime were devastating and irreversible. From this perspective, the age of the perpetrators was irrelevant. They had made a conscious decision to do something dangerous. They knew there were people below, and after the fact, they had shown total disregard for human life by fleeing without doing anything to help their victim. On the other hand, there were those who argued that the juvenile justice system exists for a reason. Teenagers' brains aren't fully developed. They don't have the same capacity as adults to evaluate risks and anticipate consequences. Locking up 2 16-year-old boys in prison for decades wouldn't bring Victoria back. From this perspective, the goal of the system should be rehabilitation, not just punishment. The teenagers had done something terrible, but they were still young. They still had the possibility to change, to grow, to become productive members of society. Neurological science partially supported this argument. It's well established that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and decision-making, doesn't finish developing until approximately age 25. Teenagers are, literally, less capable of evaluating the consequences of their actions than adults. But that doesn't mean they don't know the difference between right and wrong. Jaden and Jordan clearly knew that what they had done was wrong. That's why they fled. That's why they kept silent. That's why they didn't tell their parents or authorities. The debate had no easy answers, and the final decision on how to handle the case rested in the hands of the judicial system. The following months were filled with complex legal proceedings. The defense attorneys for Jaden and Jordan filed motions to have their clients tried as minors instead of adults. They argued that the teenagers had no significant criminal records, that the crime hadn't been premeditated in the traditional way, and that the juvenile justice system was better equipped to handle cases like this. The prosecution opposed these motions. They argued that the gravity of the crime justified treatment as adults, and that allowing the teenagers to avoid adult consequences would send the wrong message about the seriousness of their actions. There were hearings. There were arguments. There were delays caused by various factors, including the COVID-19 pandemic that complicated judicial proceedings across the country during 2020. Throughout the entire process, Victoria's family had to relive the trauma again and again. Each hearing, each news story about the case, each time Jaden and Jordan's names appeared in the media, was a reminder of what they had lost. Fritz Schafer, Victoria's husband, spoke publicly several times about the case. He expressed his frustration with the slowness of the legal process. He expressed his pain over the loss of his wife, and he expressed his hope that in the end, there would be some kind of justice for Victoria. Victoria's children were also affected by the prolonged legal process. They had to grow up with the knowledge that those responsible for their mother's death were still awaiting trial. They had to listen to public debates about whether those responsible deserved clemency or severe punishment. Eventually, both Jaden and Jordan reached plea agreements with the prosecution. This meant they would avoid a full trial in exchange for pleading guilty to specific charges. The exact details of the agreements varied slightly between the two cases, but the overall result was similar for both. Instead of facing murder charges, which could have resulted in life sentences, the teenagers pleaded guilty to reduced charges of involuntary manslaughter and reckless or negligent assault. Plea agreements are common in the American judicial system. They allow cases to be resolved more quickly, save system resources, and provide certainty to all parties involved. For the prosecution, they guarantee a conviction without the risk of a trial that could result in acquittal. For the defense, they generally result in lighter sentences than they might get after a lost trial. The sentencing hearings were emotional moments for everyone involved. Victoria's family had the opportunity to give impact statements, describing to the court how Victoria's death had affected their lives. Fritz spoke about the loss of his life partner, the woman he had planned to grow old with. Victoria's children, some already teenagers, spoke about growing up without their mother. Jaden and Jordan's parents were also present, visibly distressed by the situation their children found themselves in. No matter what you think about what the teenagers did, their families were also suffering. Jaden and Jordan themselves had the opportunity to speak at their sentencing hearings. According to reports, both expressed remorse for what they had done. Both apologized to Victoria's family, but words, however sincere they might be, couldn't undo what they had done. The final sentences included time in juvenile facilities, followed by periods of probation. The exact details varied between the two cases. Given that they were minors at the time of the crime and pleaded guilty to reduced charges, the sentences were considerably lighter than they would have been if they had been convicted as adults for murder. Jordan Buckley was sentenced to 3 years in a juvenile facility. Jaden Churchius received a similar sentence. For many in the community, the sentences seemed too light. 3 years for killing a mother of 4 children? 3 years for destroying a family? For others, the sentences appropriately reflected the age of the perpetrators and the non-premeditated nature of the crime. The teenagers hadn't set out to kill Victoria. They had made a stupid decision with tragic consequences. There was no way everyone could be satisfied with the outcome. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and leave a comment to continue the conversation. See you in the next episode.